May God bless you for being here. And it is wonderful, wonderful to see you. Since last weekend, the 4th of July weekend, I've been primarily talking about our nation, and for good reason. Speaking of our nation, a few years ago, I came across an article entitled Only in America, and I think there are actually songs now by that title. But some of the points made in that article was, only in America can you get a pizza delivered to your house much faster than an ambulance. And sadly, that's true. Only in America do people park as close as possible to the entrance of health clubs to keep from walking very far. Only in America do drugstores force sick people to walk all the way to the back to get their medication and prescriptions, while the healthy people are allowed to buy their cigarettes and lottery tickets right up front. Why is that? Only in America do we call the time of day with the slowest traffic rush hour. Don't understand that one. Now this one really gets to me. Only in America do we have drive-through ATM machines with Braille lettering. Drive-through with Braille, I've seen some drivers that didn't surprise me, including myself. Only in America do we park our $40,000 vehicles in our driveways because our garages are full of $40 worth of junk. Yeah, that happens more often than we want to admit. All right, now last Sunday I emphasized the fact that few nations in the history of the world have been as blessed as the United States of America, and we have been. We really need to constantly thank God for our blessings. I mean, from our individual rights to our prosperity, to opportunities, to privileges, conveniences, and the continued preservation, at least up to this point, of the vast majority of our freedoms. But I also asked this question last week: how long can we expect God to continue to bless us? How much longer, especially in view of Psalms 9:17? The wicked shall be turned into hell, and all the nations that forget God. Now, admittedly, there are still millions of people in the United States that fear God, but there are far more that have forgotten God, or worse, turn their backs against Him. In many places, the Bible is not only ignored, but ridiculed. God's laws are frequently ignored. We live in a nation in which abortion, homosexuality, and same-sex marriage are actually promoted, endorsed, if not glorified. And they are glorified by some. And how tragic is that? Where adultery and fornication and pornography are unbridled, as is the use of alcoholic beverages, illicit drugs, and gambling. For some, by the way, gambling is their national pastime, and I'm not talking about a few 100,000. I'm talking about many millions of Americans. We're living in a country where God, the Bible, and prayer are virtually absent from our public schools, where instead of worshiping God, many prefer to worship themselves, or their wealth or possessions, or sex, or sports, or even certain celebrities. That being the case, how much longer will God bless us? In Psalms 50, verse 22, David also wrote, "Now consider this, you who forget God, lest I tear you to pieces, and there be none that deliver." In Romans chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, Paul said, "To those who are self-seeking and do not obey the truth, but obey unrighteousness, here's what's coming: indignation, wrath, tribulation, anguish." And if he doesn't describe many in our nation in that verse, I don't know what does. Has it ever occurred to you that the primary reason our nation has been so blessed is that we were, at one time, a God-fearing nation? And not that many years ago, we were a more God-fearing nation than we are today. In fact, the founders of our country were profoundly influenced by God and the Bible. And for those that are skeptical, I know most of you aren't, but there are many who are skeptical of that, who would deny that. I'm sharing 4 proofs that confirm that the founders of our country were greatly influenced by God and his word. I shared one of those proofs last week. I'll share 2 more this morning and then 1 tonight to close this mini-series. The one I shared this morning, the number one proof that our country was influenced by God. America was originally settled by people that possessed an overriding respect for God and his laws. If you were not here last week, that lesson will be available as of this morning. You can find the link on our Facebook page. Many of you may have received a text message this morning indicating such. But I do want to repeat one thing I said last week. In the early colonies, the first public building that was erected was a church building. And the first public service that occurred in the colonies was a worship service to God in heaven. So many people have no idea of that. And now the second proof. The founders of our independence. Now this is strange when you hear it. The founders of our independence fervently desired to return to God. Return to God? Weren't they already pretty much on God's side? No. Not by the time it came about where we were seeking independence as a nation from England. Listen carefully. After the original settlers died, and they were, many of them, very devoted to God, after they died and their children and their grandchildren, generations arose that were more interested not so much in God and freedom to worship God, but in prosperity. In fact, when the word reached Europe that the New World offered riches as well as religious freedom, waves and waves of incoming immigrants sought first wealth, prosperity. And as a consequence, the spiritual atmosphere of the New World dramatically declined. It wasn't long before profit was the new God, before slavery was introduced. Bribery, injustice, violence, and superstition, as evidenced by the Salem witch trials, increased. And as that occurred, churches began to wither on the vine. By 1730, only 10% of the people in the colonies attended any worship service, when just a few generations before it was 75%. Well, fortunately, some very God-fearing men became so alarmed at what had happened in the colonies that they decided to take action. They sought a return to the religious zeal of the original colonists. So in 1734, a handful of preachers, among them Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, Gilbert Tennant, and others, initiated across the colonies revivals in church buildings, brush arbors, city auditoriums, and because of the fervency of their message to return to God or else, these revivals were packed. They drew enormous crowds, and revivals began occurring in all 13 original colonies. Countless thousands, in fact, they long lost track of the thousands that were being baptized into Christ. This is what is sometimes called, by the way, in America, the Great Awakening. It was a spiritual awakening. It was the opening of the eyes of those in the colonies to their need for God and for Jesus Christ. Listen to what Benjamin Franklin wrote about that. He said, "It was wonderful to see the change soon made in the manners of our inhabitants. From being thoughtless or indifferent about religion, it seemed as if the world were growing religious, so that one could not walk through the town in any evening without hearing psalms sung in different families on every street." In a few short years, church attendance went up dramatically from 10% to well over 60%. Now here's an important PS, postscript to that. The Great Awakening, religious revival, was the precursor for the American Revolution. Those that wrote and signed the Declaration of Independence, who framed the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, all grew up during this Great Awakening, this great revival. And it had a profound effect and lasting effect on each of them. What a lot of people don't understand is most of the leaders of the American Revolution were inspired by the need to return to God and His Word. Listen to a prayer from the diary of who's called the father of our nation, George Washington. Let my heart, gracious God, be so affected with your glory and majesty, that I may discharge those weighty duties which thou requirest of me. Again, I have called on thee for pardon and forgiveness of sins, for the sacrifice of Jesus Christ offered on the cross for me. Thou gavest thy Son to die for me, and hast given me assurance of my salvation. George Washington, who was affected by this great awakening, and he was not alone. Years ago, political science professors at the University of Houston collected some 15,000 writings of the original founders of our independence. They had one goal in mind. They wanted to determine the primary source of ideas for the Constitution and identify the sources most quoted by the framers and signers of the Constitution. Guess what the primary source was? Far beyond anything else, the Bible. God's Word. 94% of the quotes of the founders of our nation came right from the Bible or were based on God's Word. Amazing. How wonderful is that? Please remember that the founders of our independence were profoundly influenced by faith in God and the Bible. And the third proof of our religious roots, that's really what we're talking about, was America was founded by men and women who almost unanimously acknowledged the rule of God over the world and the affairs of man. I want you to understand something. Our founders were not perfect, nor were they all Christians, but virtually all, and again, well over 90%, acknowledged God as the supreme ruler over man and nations. All you have to do is listen to the prologue of the Declaration of Independence. You've heard these words, but listen as we emphasize God there. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. We're not just accidents of design of nature. We're created equal. And that they are endowed, which means a gift given to, by their Creator, which they all understood to be God, with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They believe those are rights God has given every man, every woman. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Someone has put that in one sentence. They said, we desire a government that will protect the rights that the Creator has given to each of us. Moreover, in their charges against the King of England at the time, they wrote, we, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress, assembled, appealing to the supreme judge of the world. They were all referring to God there. The Declaration of Independence concludes with these words, and for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, that's God, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. At the First Continental Congress, the wording of the actual Declaration of Independence was hotly debated. There was a lot of disagreement. And finally, in desperation, this suggestion was given, and I quote, "Everyone, get down on your knees and ask God for wisdom and guidance." The framers and the signers of the Declaration were told to do this. And every single one did. Every single man got down on his knees and prayed. John Adams, later on in a letter to his wife Abigail, wrote about that meeting. He said the most amazing thing occurred, speaking of the prayers. Even the stern old Quakers had tears gushing down their cheeks. As the Declaration of Independence was being signed, Samuel Adams, who's known as the father of the Revolution, made this statement publicly. He was so proud. But listen to his words. He said, "We have this day restored the sovereign to whom all men ought to be obedient. He reigns in heaven. And from the rising to the setting of the sun, let his kingdom come." And for those who say our country was not rooted in God and the Bible, how mistaken they are. Well, we will pause here and conclude tonight. I said last week that you and I cannot change the direction of our entire nation. But there are things we can do. We can certainly remember and acknowledge and even share with others the important role that God and his word played in the formation of the country. These lessons are being recorded, and they will appear week by week on YouTube. We'll have the links on our Facebook page. And please don't hesitate to share these with others who need to know this. But also we need to continue to pray for our nation, and we need to continue to pray for our leaders. As one person recently suggested, we need to pray for national revival, a return, just like those who are so involved in the Declaration of Independence desire to return to God, feeling that this needed God more than anything. But thirdly, we need to remain as faithful to God and Jesus Christ as we can. And that, by the way, was the big problem. A few generations after this, the pilgrims came to our nation. People began to be less reliant on God. Not that they didn't believe in God. They weren't that many atheists. They just got focused on other things. And God took literally the back seat. And we have to be so careful. That's what Satan is trying to do to us. If any of you need to respond to the invitation, please don't hesitate. Don't leave the building without doing so. Come up and have a seat, and we'll assist you.